Have you ever really wanted to learn a language and you started learning it, but after a few weeks or a few months, you just get bored of it? Maybe you bought a book and you were so excited, and the first few days working on that book felt so much fun. And it was a great experience, but after a while, it felt boring. You didn't want to do it anymore, and you wanted to move on to something else? Well, that's normal. And as a matter of fact, that can be the way you learn the language. 안녕하세요, 클라우드입니다. Hey guys, Cloud here. Motivation and discipline are things that are often required to learn a language, but motivation is fleeting sometimes, and discipline is hard to achieve. But one thing that's not fleeting, and one thing that's not hard to achieve, is thoughts. Thoughts are there, regardless of whether you like it or not. Most of the day, you're thinking of things, and they can be very random. They can really vary throughout the day. You might be thinking of a new business that you want to start up, or what you want to do 30 years in the future, or even 5 days in the future, or what's your dream company that you're going to build, your enterprise that you're going to build. Or it could be just, becoming a famous singer, or regardless of what it is. Thoughts vary throughout the day, and sometimes you get these ideas that you really want to go through. But then you think of a different idea, or you stop thinking about it because it might not be realistic for you to actually do it, like traveling the world or backpacking through Europe or something like that. Each person's thoughts are their own and they're different, but what's similar between everybody is they have these kind of thoughts. Now, why am I talking about thoughts when it comes to language learning? Well, it's similar. For a lot of people, what ends up happening is you have a book and you're really excited to use that book or to read that book, but then after a while you get bored of it and you want to do something else. And that something else might be a different language, or it might be a different hobby. It might not even be language learning at all. It might be, going to the gym, and then it might turn into like going to a karaoke and practicing singing, and then it might be drawing. It could be a lot of different things. It might be binging shows on Netflix. The things that you end up doing day to day and consistently change a lot, kind of like how your thoughts go from A to B to C to Z to Q all over the place. But what's interesting is when you think about how a project is done, like if somebody thinks of an idea and they make it a reality, it's not that they have one thought and then they take that thought and they make it happen. What ends up happening is their thoughts actually move around just like everybody else, but there's a theme to those thoughts. So with the example of starting a restaurant, the thoughts might be, I can start a restaurant. I can start a Korean restaurant, just because that's the theme of this channel, but it could be a Korean restaurant. And all the thoughts are surrounding the location and how, just the holistic view of people coming in and ordering food and making money and, having that relationship with the customers and really good food, taking some food home, eating while you're on lunch, that kind of stuff. And then you might not necessarily get bored of that idea, but you might start thinking of other things. So hiring people and your relationship with employees and whatnot. And then it might be, something on the more legal side. And then it might be like, how are you going to get the money to buy? So even though it has nothing to do with the restaurant specifically, but it's like, how do I get money to do this thing? Do I have to save up for it? Do I take a loan? Is there someone that I know? Like things like that. So all of those thoughts, they're different thoughts, and you're moving from one thought to the other. It's not even finishing the thought. You might be moving from A to B to C, just all over the place without finishing one of them. But the fact of the matter is all those thoughts have a similar theme. They're in the same house, if you think of it that way. And language learning is kind of like that. If you are bored of a book, or you're bored of this drama, you're bored of this webtoon, regardless, you're reading homework, you're speaking, you don't want to speak anymore, you're listening, podcasts are boring, you don't want to do that anymore. You can jump from one thing to the next. You don't have to be consistent with what you're doing. Jumping around is sometimes actually very useful. Now, being consistent in doing something is different than being consistent in doing a lot of different things. So those are two different things. Basically, ideally, you want to have the same theme of learning Korean, and regardless of what you're doing inside of that house, like going back to the previous example, as long as you're within that house, you're being consistent. Even if it's not the same actions, you're not in the same room every single time, that's fine, you're in the house. But the problem comes when you go outside of the house, and then that's a different issue. That's not what we're talking about today. And it doesn't even have to be an issue. That can be fine. You could be going from one language to the next and dabbling and jumping back and forth. But right now, I'm just talking about learning one language. Um, so yeah, like I was saying, once you start jumping around, you don't get as bored. You don't get those demotivated times where you just don't want to do it. One thing I did was I was reading manhwa, and I would jump around between three different manhwas. What was it? There was Tower of God. There was Hardcore Leveling Warrior, and there was one more that I can't remember. It's also like um, a long one. Oh, I can't remember right now. I finished reading it a while ago. But the point is, it's not that I didn't want to read one of them or I got bored of reading. It's that I would get bored of the story, especially since a lot of hard words would come, especially in the beginning. Like, I didn't know 90% of the words, and after a while, I just get bored with it. And then I go to the next story, and I get really, engrossed in the story, and I want to read it. And then I go to the next story, and then I go back to the first one. I'm like, oh my god, I remember this next arc's going to be really cool, and things like that. I would jump around, and sometimes, you know what, I get bored of reading. Right now, I'm actually in a state where I don't really want to read compared to what I was reading just last week. Literally last week, I spent, I think, like 10 to 15 hours reading Korean manhwas, and then I read Chinese manhwas in English like for probably another 10 to 15 hours. That was almost a full-time job of just reading manga. But then like I just got bored of it. I read a lot the past week, so this week I read probably like 2 hours maybe at most. But even in the past, when I'd have these times where I didn't want to read, what I would do is I just go watch something. I'm not a big watcher, but I did, and sometimes I'd find things that I enjoy. Like I watched this drama called Signal, and that was pretty good by Gobili Korean's recommendation. He recommended that to me. He told me that, and I watched it. And then I also watched one of my friends recommended Heart Signal, and we would go each week and we would talk about it in Korean, and that was pretty cool. It's not really my thing, but I watched it. It was entertaining enough that I ended up watching it. I would watch a few episodes here and there of what is it called? Running Man. But the point is, like, I would go back and forth between things just to not be bored. Or rather, because I'm bored of one thing and I want to move on. Like, my thoughts are just jumping from one place to the next. And you can do that too. You don't have to open a book and finish it from A to Z. You don't have to buy a new textbook and then finish the textbook. You can study, like, whatever. If the first 3 chapters are really enjoyable, entertaining, and then you feel bored and you want to do something else, stop at those 3 chapters. Start just, talking and practicing whatever you learned. And then maybe you don't want to speak anymore, you just feel exhausted. Then maybe just watch some dramas and start recognizing the words that you said, the words that you heard, and the words that you read and learned, and try doing that for a while. And then maybe you finish your drama and you feel empty inside. You can go back to the book, or you can try something else. You can try reading something or listening to a podcast. I mean, there's just so much that you can do. Now, another issue comes, which is like finding new content that you actually enjoy is difficult. But if you already know what content you like in your native language, you just have to find that kind of thing in your target language. So for me, I love reading manga. I love reading manga. It was very, very easy for me to read webtoons. I didn't need to think twice about it. I jumped onto that thing. Korean dramas, I mean, I'm not a big watcher, and even till now, like it's hard for me to watch something. So that wasn't much of an issue. So I always try to recommend to people, like, what is it that you enjoy doing? Like, if you enjoy, watching soccer videos or whatever, watch them in Korean. Actually, I was recently watching a soccer video, so that's why I gave this example. I love playing sports. But if that's your thing, do that in your target language. And it doesn't have to be all the time. It can just be some of the time, so that you still get that in your native language or a language that you understand. But regardless, finding material, that's probably a whole separate episode of the podcast of like how to find things that you enjoy, if I haven't made that already. But there's a lot of resources out there, and just from what you already do day to day, those are things that you can try to do to find that material so that you can switch whenever you feel like it. Don't feel pressure to stay with one like resource. That's another thing. Like, there's a lot of grammar resources, like Talk to Me in Korean, How to Study Korean, and Korean Gobeli and Korean Onni, and like Minji teaches Korean, and the list goes on and on and on. And some people start feeling like they jump from one to the next, and they start from the beginning every single time. And instead of seeing them as complementary or like as they go together, they think of them as separate resources that they have to start from the very beginning. You don't need to do that. You don't need to start from level one on every single resource. Kind of think of grammar as just this thing, you know? And regardless of what resource you're using or which one you enjoy, you're just learning grammar. Think of vocab. Maybe you have like a topic book with vocab, and then you have another memorized course or Anki deck that you've made that's vocab. Don't think of them as mutually exclusive. Like, oh, I did 3 lessons here, but that doesn't count towards my other decks. No, they all count together. They all go hand in hand. And if you jump from category to category rather than resource to resource, which jumping resource to resource does help, don't get me wrong, but if you think of going from category to category, it can alleviate some of that burden, some of that burnout that you feel, and keep things fresh and interesting for you. So those are my thoughts on, or thoughts, because the theme of this was like thoughts. That's the analogy that I chose to go with. Sorry, bad pun. But yeah, watch your thoughts as well. If you feel like you're bored with it, then think to yourself, okay, well, what else can I do within that same house, within the same context, within the language learning? If it's, hey, I want to go out to a Korean escape room, like I don't know if there's any in the US, but you could be in Korea for all I know. Like maybe that's something that you'll enjoy. Maybe you'll enjoy watching people do that kind of thing. Try to be creative with it, and just stay in that house as much as you can, and jump through all of the rooms if you have to. But staying in the house will keep your language learning progressing. So that's all I had to say today.